When I was about 10 years old, my older brother and I were visiting my dad here in Atlanta for a summer. And this is shortly after Safe House had started. And he was still doing a lot of street outreach, a lot of under the bridge outreach before Safe House ever got any kind of facility. And this specific summer, I remember extremely well because we pulled up to this place where the Jimmy Carter Library now sits, and there was a kudzu village. And I remember we got out of the Safe House van, and I remember as a little kid getting out of the van and looking over, and there was a chain link fence along the wall with a lot of overgrowth. And my dad pulled the chain link fence to the side that had been previously cut, and he, myself, my older brother, and then a couple other Safe House team members went through this chain link fence. And if you know anything about kudzu, you know that it overtakes everything around it. And we go through the fence into this brush, and there's a canopy of ivy, a canopy of this greenery that that presented to us kind of like what we're looking at right here, where there's some overgrowth and there's a space underneath. And as you're walking around, we came across a gentleman named Darrell. And at this point in my life, I was a big reader, and we started talking to Darrell, and Darrell led us into his hut that he had built. And inside of Darrell's hut, there were just walls, 3-4 different walls. My memory tells me of just books from floor to ceiling. And I was a big reader, and I thought Darrell was goals. He was living outside. He got to read all day. He didn't have to report to anybody. He could do whatever Darrell wanted to do in life. And I remember thinking just how cool Darrell was as a person as I was hearing his story and hearing about him as an individual. And so that encounter ends. You know, I'm a 9-year-old kid at that point in my life, and I don't fully understand what homelessness means and what it really looks like other than Darrell. So the trip to Atlanta ends. I go back home with my older brother to Texas, and about a month or two later, I get a phone call from my dad, and he's like, "Hey, Josh, do you remember Darrell?" And of course I remember Darrell. He's my goal in life. I want to be like Darrell. I want to read all day. And he said that Darrell's hut underneath the overgrowth, lined with books, had caught on fire, and Darrell passed away in that fire. And that left the mark on me because Darrell wasn't just some random homeless guy. Darrell was Darrell. Darrell had a story, and I got to see a small snapshot of Darrell's life that summer. And my hope with what we do at Safe House, with what we do with this podcast, where we're sitting down and engaging people, is that those of us who sit down and get to know these individuals, who hear their stories, we see not just a moment in time, but that we hopefully become part of their story and they become part of our story. So that when we are 20, 30, 40 years later, like I am with Darrell, we can engage other people the way that we would want to engage that person whose story we heard deeply. So my hope is that as we watch these interviews, as we watch these podcasts, and we hear these individuals tell us what their life has been like, we can learn from them in the same way that we want those around us to learn from us.